Hello out there, all you marvelous mosquito fish. Thanks for joining us for another episode of A Little Greener, a podcast all about nature, conservation, and sustainability. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Sarah, and I'm joined by the always marvelous Casey. I know you're not necessarily having a marvelous day, Casey, but it's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. You are the highlight of my day, Sarah. So I
It
appreciate
doesn't sound
you.
like I have much competition today.
Well, yeah, it's just one of those days. Sarah, what is a mosquito fish? I'm like
It's a
genuinely
freshwater
curious.
fish
Okay.
that I think there are different kinds, some that are native in parts of the United States, and then there's another one. I did 60 seconds of research on this. So we have, I think, the eastern mosquito fish that's native to part of the country, and then there's the western mosquito fish that's native to part of the country. But mosquito fish have also, again, according to my 60 seconds of research, been introduced in other places around the world for mosquito control, but they are considered an invasive species in some places. So depending on where you live, mosquito fish may or may not, in fact, be marvelous.
Um, they're cutie patooties.
They are.
And you can buy them at Petco, according to the internet. So apparently they're tank fish. So
Choose your pets
they,
wisely.
yeah,
Research before you
for
buy.
real. And don't release them out into
And
the
don't release them
wild.
into the wild.
Oh, but they're so cute. Anyway, at least these individual first three pictures in Google.
Not our most heavily researched
No, not at
intro, but
all. I learned something though. That's what
there
this
you go.
podcast is about. We're learning stuff. People are learning stuff. So we've already accomplished goal number one because I learned something today. Sarah, do you have any updates for us this week?
Nope, I'm still getting some tomatoes from my
Heck
tomato
yeah.
plant. So I don't know why I said still, but
I was gonna say we haven't even started
yeah,
tomato season
I
here yet.
am continuously getting tomatoes from my tomato plant, so that's fun. I I've honestly been slacking and failing a little bit in my outdoor time just in general and my just appreciating nature a little bit. I've still been going out for my runs, but I don't know. I've been slacking a little bit and I'm feeling it a little bit. So hopefully I'll get some reconnect time in the coming weeks.
That sounds like a good plan. I got to see my kid for the first time really experience the rain.
Oh my
Um, so
gosh.
that I think was like my most gratifying nature moment of the week was like the we were out on our porch, which is covered, and it started raining like really hard, like first kind of summer storms sort of hard, and it blew in enough that she could feel it, and she just had this look of like, what is happening? Wow.
I'm so delighted. I have tears in my
So
eyes right now.
it
That
was
is
pretty cute.
wonderful.
Thinking about that, yeah, today we had another storm and I just kind of like, she's very sick right now. So it's been kind of a bummer of a day. But I was able to kind of like whoosh her out into the raindrops a little bit
Hmm.
and she thought that was very funny because like,
Aw.
I mean, as a child, that little, how you can't even understand at all what's happening to
Hmm.
you. So
Wow,
I think
how
I'm
cool.
counting her nature moment as my nature moment because it's fun.
Yeah. How lovely.
Yes. Sarah, we're going to be talking today about a part of nature that I think that almost nobody enjoys at all. And I have been thinking about because I don't enjoy them, and we're hitting the season here in Pennsylvania where we're going to start seeing them more. So, my question for you this week, we're going to be talking about mosquitoes. My sister is the mosquito magnet of the family. Like she's the one that we go to. And of course you always say like, "Oh, it's because you're so sweet."
Uh-huh.
So I was wondering, are you so sweet or are you like me and like a little bitter?
I'm somewhere in the middle. I
Okay.
feel like in most things in my life, I'm pretty average. It depends on who I'm with, sort of. You feel like sometimes
Yeah.
you're out with somebody and you're getting eaten alive and they're not. And then there's other times where I'm out that, like, I'll get bit, but somebody else will be just like getting swarmed. So I think I just fall in that happy medium. I will say, though, it was funny, like 2 days before you told me that this was the topic for this week, I had one in my bedroom somehow
Mm.
that I just could not find, but I just kept getting bites. I had like six or seven different bites that were like swelling up before I finally got it. So I was like, yes, let's talk about it.
Let's talk about these mosquitoes. Yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a little bit of mosquito biology and ethics of widespread control. I promise at no point during this episode are you going to feel bad about swatting an individual mosquito. I told my uncle we were doing this episode, he was like, don't make me feel empathy for them. Which I don't think necessarily you'll feel empathy, but you might understand a little bit more of kind of the complexities of mosquitoes, because I definitely learned a lot. And then we'll talk at the end a little bit about things that you can do that are actually effective in helping reduce getting bitten. So stick around. Hopefully this is a practical and fun episode. All right, and we're back. Before we get too far into the episode, I want to remind everybody that we get our research from a multitude of sources that you can find listed in the show notes. I think the best resource in this show notes is a book called Mosquitopia.
That's such a good name.
I know. It is a book of papers written by biologists and environmental ethicists and historians and things like that, looking at the history of mosquito control, its effectiveness, the ethics, mosquito biology, and it's free online to read through. So if you are interested at all in any of the little things we touch on today, it's a fairly recent book. I think it was written in 2022, and there's a lot of really interesting information in there and perspectives to consider. So definitely recommend checking that out, as well as the other things that we have in our show notes, because there's a lot of resources in this one. I also want to say that like this is a very, very broad topic. And so I'm definitely not going to be hitting all the things. So if I miss something that you think is really interesting, you should definitely let us know so we can talk about it next time. But I thought we'd start real basic, Sarah, with what is a mosquito?
One of the most annoying bugs on the planet. No, it is an insect.
It is.
We'll start there. We've done episodes on insects in the past. They can be found around the world. One of the interesting things that I didn't realize until reading for this episode as well is just how many different kinds of mosquitoes there are. And now I'm curious to know how many different kinds live around here. Like, do we have multiple kinds of mosquitoes around here? But there are thousands of different types of mosquitoes. And just like I always have to tell myself with cockroaches, where there's thousands of different cockroaches and only a small percentage of them are considered pest species, it's sort of the same with mosquitoes in that there's thousands of different species. Not all of them are equal. I'll just say that for right now. What else do we want to say about mosquitoes? They're considered one of the deadliest animals on the planet.
They probably are pretty solidly the deadliest animal on the planet to humans. When you think of the diseases that they spread.
Right. It's kind of a fun, I don't want to say fun. It's a good trivia question, though, to ask somebody, because it's not necessarily what you would think of. But yeah, it is because of their role as a disease vector that makes them so deadly.
Yeah, drilling down on that a little bit, as you mentioned, lots of species. There's about 3,500 species of mosquitoes, although I've seen that number as high as 3,700 species of mosquitoes. I'm sure we're finding new ones every day. Yeah. Somewhere between 6% and 9.3% bite humans and are therefore disease vectors.
Okay, so it really is like just that few that actually bite people.
Yes.
Interesting.
Now, we'll clarify kind of like when and who and what they bite. The other ones that drink blood, which not all of them do, but they are not considered like anthrophiles. They're not really into humans as much. They're focused more on other species of animals. So there are more bird-specific ones and reptiles and other mammals and all of that. And there are lots that are just like not very specific at all and are just looking for a little blood. So that is one of the ways they can be dangerous, because they are not always very discriminatory on who they're biting. So the main way we talk about mosquitoes is about either A, their annoyance, or B, how dangerous they are as a vector for disease. So Sarah, can you list some of the diseases that they carry?
The first one that comes to my mind is heartworm for dogs. Since
Heartworm,
I've
no, for real.
spent a good portion of my life talking about that and thinking about that. There's also like equine encephalitis. I was one that I learned about in school as well. But
Sarah went to vet school
malaria
for a while.
malaria is one of the big ones. West Nile virus here in the United States would probably be the most common one that people would know.
Yes, malaria, I believe, is the most deadly as far as mosquito-borne
Hmm.
diseases. Again, the numbers are really varying, but up to 1 million people a year might die of malaria. But other diseases are things like dengue fever, yellow fever. I'm gonna have to remember how to pronounce that one. But also Zika is really recent.
Right.
So that I think is a big one that kind of like captured the news. I think one of the things that sort of surprised me during this research is how the mosquito landscape has changed even within our lifetimes. So, like, this current state of mosquitoes is not a given, and that is part of the ethics of the whole thing. Certain species of mosquitoes are invasive in different areas and often were transported by guess who? We brought them with us from other parts of the world to new places. So the spread of these diseases really has to do with us as well as those mosquitoes.
Just as hitchhikers, right? Like we
Yes.
we
Oh,
started
yeah.
traveling to places and had mosquito larvae end up
Y-
or whatever.
Yes. For example, if there was like water
Hmm.
sitting in a container, it might have had
Yeah.
mosquito larvae in it. This is the one. It's uh chikungunya, which is like a debilitating joint pain
I
disease.
am not familiar with that one.
It's listed fairly highly. Like it is apparently one of the ones that is just extremely painful without a vaccine or real good treatment currently. And so these are diseases that are especially prevalent in areas of the world that are warm all year round because mosquitoes are most often active when it is warm out because they're insects and they're cold-blooded. Um, and often in areas of the world that don't have super secure healthcare systems, access to vaccines or preventative measures, all can impact how much disease is out there. So that's really like as humans, we think about them as like, ooh, yuck, we don't like them because they like best case scenario bite you and you're itchy. Or like our friend Kristen, who is allergic to mosquito bites. So she gets those big old welts when she gets
Hmm.
bitten. But in some parts of the world, like this is a deadly
Hmm.
part of life. One of the things to think about is that the mosquitoes are the vector, but they are not the disease themselves. And the diseases come from a bunch of different sources. They could be viral, but they can also be bacteria, which is what malaria is, and nematodes even. So like a lot of different parasites basically in the mosquitoes themselves.
And it's really interesting when you sort of just look at it intellectually and you're not having to deal with a
Yeah.
mosquito bite in person, how this happens, how they take up whatever disease agent and then it gets transferred to us through their saliva as they're injecting it. The mechanics of a mosquito bite are really fascinating when you can watch it from the outside.
Yeah, let's get into it a little bit. I don't go very deep into it, but Sarah, do you know what mosquito bites us?
The females, is that what you're
The
asking?
females.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's what
yeah. It's
yeah,
only the
vaguely asking
ladies.
there. Only the ladies. Not even every species of mosquito seems to actually even need this. Like there's a handful that seem to not need to bite and get what is uncomfortably called a blood meal.
Yeah.
I don't like that phrase at all, but I had to read it 50,000 times for this article. They have to get a blood meal which has the proper like proteins and enzymes and things that they need from our blood to be able to produce
To
eggs.
have babies, yeah, to produce their eggs, which again, not trying to make you feel bad about swatting a mosquito because goodness knows I smacked that one in my bedroom as soon as I could find it. But just put it in perspective, right?
They're
To
just
us,
doing
the
their
mosquitoes
job.
are a nuisance, but these moms just want to build their eggs.
Nope, not gonna feel bad. But yes, from yeah, this is what they have to do. They are driven
Yeah,
by biology
there
because
is a purpose to it. Yeah, they're
they
not just going
have to
around
do
being
it.
annoying. Yeah.
Again, we're not going to get too deep into the actual bite mechanism, but the males actually just drink nectar from plants and plant sugars, and they don't have mouth parts that are sharp enough to be able to penetrate human skin. The females do, and when they are, quote, biting you, they're not really biting you. They're kind of like making a very small incision and inserting their little proboscis guy, and they actually inject you with things,
Yep.
which I don't like either.
Well, that's how they become a disease vector is
Oh,
through
totally.
injecting the things.
Yes. And the parasites themselves are not always active in their system to become transmittable. Like the parasitic viruses and bacteria have to get to a certain stage of their own metamorphosis to travel to the mouth parts of the mosquito to infect you. So like there's a lot of biology
Hmm.
working together. But the female actually injects you with an anticoagulant, which means that you're not going to clot immediately when she injects you, and kind of like a numbing agent so that you don't immediately feel the bite. Typically, you're kind of not really knowing what's going on unless you see it often. And then she drinks some blood up, and that helps her create her eggs.
And they like have receptors too to help them find the blood vessels and all
Oh my
kinds of
gosh.
crazy stuff.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in the episode because I wanted to know why some people are sweet-blooded and some people aren't.
Interesting.
But we're talking about eggs right now and reproduction. So the females need that blood meal to be able to produce eggs. And one article I was looking at said that there are different species of mosquitoes that cohabitate in the same sort of environment, and they're able to recognize members of their own species, seemingly at least partially through the cadence of their wing beats.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
Incredible.
So mosquitoes are typically inactive if it's 50 degrees or cooler, and their activity is greatly reduced at 60 degrees or cooler. But if it's over 60 degrees, they're doing their thing and they flap their wings, depending on the species, 300 to 600 beats per second. So that's why you hear that like little whining buzz
Mhm.
in your ear. That's how fast it's going.
So annoying. It just makes me like cringe
I
just
know, I'm
having you say that.
angry. So the males and females find each other and they mate. Now, another thing we'll visit a little bit later is that it's not automatically successful because there are certain mosquito species that have gut bacteria that has been so specialized to them that they can now only reproduce with members of their same species that have the compatible strain of the gut bacteria that they have. If they meet a partner that has an incompatible strain of that gut bacteria, they will lay infertile eggs.
I don't even know what to there. That's a dating app waiting to happen right there. Matched by your gut bacteria.
Yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit about bacteria and this whole thing, but one of the things that I sort of reconceptualized during this research is we think of mosquitoes like very much as this negative, almost evil sort of thing. Like, what is your point? Like,
Right.
what are you even here for other to then to torture us slowly? Um, but it seems like a lot of mosquito behavior is actually influenced greatly by microbes. So their ability to reproduce for some species is hinging upon this bacteria that they don't have any control over. And the bacteria on us and in them may influence their biting as well. So they are not necessarily the controllers of their own destiny in the way that we think that they are. They are driven by things that like are even smaller.
just a whole new perspective
Whew.
on mosquitoes. This feels almost philosophical now. Can we really be mad at the mosquitoes, or
Read
should we
Miss
be mad at the
Mosquitopia, I'm telling you, it has a lot of conversation about this. Is yeah, we're mad at the mosquitoes, but it is not the mosquitoes that are genuinely the problem. It's the disease in the end. So anyway, the mosquito female is typically going to lay her eggs. She lays like 200, 250 eggs at a time. And Sarah, where does she lay her eggs? Do you
by
know?
the water? Yeah. So
Yeah.
gotta check and make sure you don't have any puddles piling up in buckets and crevices out around your house to help control that mosquito population. Maybe jumping ahead there.
Yeah, no, I mean, like they are not picky about typically the types of water that they lay near. Now, there's two different types of reproductive strategies that mosquito species might have. One is a rapid hatch, and they generally lay their eggs directly in water. They basically have like a raft of eggs that float on the water. And they hatch very, very quickly and turn into larvae. The other type of species has more of a delayed reproduction where they can lay their eggs in an area that is not moist. So, for example, in an area that is experiencing a bunch of drought at the time or has infrequent rains, oftentimes they will lay their eggs in an area that may flood later. And those eggs are very resistant to desiccation. They're not going to dry out super fast. In fact, they can lie dormant for months or even years until the conditions are right.
Do you know in situations like that if when the mosquito is laying their eggs, is she laying them in a place that she knows water will come? Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I do.
Like,
I don't know 100% the answer. What I will say is that scientists studying mosquitoes, first of all, have had such contradictory, wide-ranging results in almost all the studies that we're trying to determine any sort of solid answers about them. But we do know that they have really sensitive olfactory systems where
mhm.
they can smell things. And so some species will seek out water that has like decaying things in it. So they're specifically looking for stagnant water. Others seem to be just drawn to water vapor. And so I'm sure that there's some sort of part of that particular
Yeah.
location that has some sort of bacteria that influences where they're going to be laying their eggs. So
Yeah.
that is something because we'll talk a little bit about more the control element that we're still sort of learning from some of them. But if those rapid hatch species lay their eggs where it is not like where there isn't water, or if the water disappears really quickly, those eggs cannot stand up. So, like you said, having standing water around, if you get rid of it and there are mosquito eggs in it, then the mosquito eggs won't hatch, which is great. The water needs to be in place long enough for the larva to develop and have proper food resources to develop. So, mosquitoes are like butterflies. They go through a metamorphosis, perhaps not as beautiful. Um, but they start out as larvae in the water and they feed on algae and bacteria. This is from Mosquitopia. Copepods, which are small crustaceans, other organic matter, and microorganisms. Some mosquito species will actually eat other mosquito larvae, so they will cannibalize.
Ooh.
Yes, more on that later as well. So they have to have enough food in there to get them through their metamorphosis. The metamorphosis for a lot of these species takes about 2 weeks to go from hatching to adulthood. But it doesn't have to be a big pile of water. It can be a tree hollow. It can be a big leaf that has water collecting in it and human-made containers, as well as larger bodies of water like ponds and
Mhm.
wetlands. So they are not particularly picky, especially as you look at them as a group of species as a whole and not just as like an individual species. So because multiple species live in an area at a time, it can be difficult to target one area that would reduce all mosquito populations. You sort of have to look at it as a species by species case. Once they get into adulthood, they live about 2 to 4 weeks in that adult farm. So I think it's important to look at the reproduction process because it's important to identify all the parts in their life cycle that are weak, like have these potential areas to poke holes in that would
Hmm.
help control the populations overall. That being said, mosquitoes have ecosystem roles to play. They are not just there for our torment. We are not like Sisyphus being, tortured forever, although fighting mosquitoes is very Sisyphusian. So one of the big ones is that the transfer of nutrients from aquatic ecosystems to terrestrial ones. And this is something that I don't think we really think very much about is nature as a whole. We're talking very microscopic today, is a series of energy and nutrient transfers when you look at like how things eat and poop and live, and the food web all has to do with being able to transfer energy from one area to the other. And sometimes the nutrients in aquatic ecosystems don't make it back to terrestrial ones and vice versa. So this is something that we talk about with bears on a different level is bears fish for salmon in Alaska, for example. They drag the fish up, they eat part of the fish, they leave the rest of it, and the nutrients in that fish get absorbed by the plants in the terrestrial ecosystem and allow the trees there to reach higher heights than they would otherwise. So in a much smaller way, the mosquitoes having a part of their life cycle in the water transfers those nutrients eating those copepods and the algae up into the terrestrial ecosystem. You look skeptical.
Oh, I like this because it is a little more specific. Not that mosquitoes are the only animal that does this for sure, but it is a little more specific because when people would ask, I used to have to talk about insects fairly regularly in one of my past jobs, and people would endlessly bring up mosquitoes as we're trying to help them
Yeah.
have a more positive view of insects. We would get asked about mosquitoes. And my main answer was just, well, they are food. They're food for a lot of animals. That is an important role that they play in the ecosystem. But even internally, I was like,
This is not very
I mean,
convincing.
yes, but like most all of these animals have many other food sources as well. So I actually don't really know that they would, come to much harm if they didn't have mosquitoes. But so I do like that this is taking it maybe one step more specific than that answer. It's just
Yeah.
not enough to, it still sort of just feels like it boils down to their food for other animals. That's the role.
Yeah. Okay, here's another specific thing from Mosquitopia. Chapter 2 has to do a lot with the biology of them. Quote, so fundamental are mosquitoes in the food chain that when their numbers were controlled in the Carmage region of southern France, breeding success of house martins were reduced by some 25% compared to
Okay.
untreated areas.
All right. That's a good specific example. I like that. I can
Yeah,
use
it
that.
feels very cause effect. And okay, we'll give like one more positive example. As mentioned before, the males don't drink blood at all. It's just the females. They do need to eat as adults. They are
Yes.
pollinators.
Yes. That I have mentioned that too in the
I
past.
don't know that I knew that, but they are actually pollinators specifically in wetlands and are important pollinators for some rare species. So, like, there's some orchids that live in New York and Pennsylvania that have a species of mosquito that is their like main pollinator. So there is some specificity to it. So Mosquitopia sort of frames like this idea of should we try and eradicate the like mosquito, even if we're just focusing on the ones that impact humans, for example. And in that conversation, they talk about all these reasons why it's hard. um, because, do the mosquitoes even deserve it? And is it really the mosquitoes that we're even fighting? Because it's really the diseases that are the problem. And also, there's a lot of, I think, more convincing arguments of it doesn't work,
Right.
but they acknowledge basically the list for killing them is shorter, but not less compelling, which is that millions of people over the course of human history have died because of mosquitoes. They are a vector for disease for us and for lots of other species. So, as much as we're bringing up these positive things, I don't want to reduce the impact of the fact that there is large scale human suffering because mosquitoes interact with those diseases and bring them to humans and they spread them. So those couple things that I listed there are not meant to be like, see, they're not so bad. It's to say they have a role.
Yeah, I think it's always important to look at the complete picture.
Right. So should we wipe out the mosquitoes? Sarah, what are the pros and cons of wiping out the mosquitoes?
Well, I mean, I think we've just sort of summarized it. The pros would be eliminating a huge disease vector.
Yeah.
This would be saving so many human lives around the world, and that is a pretty important pro. Like that's really the pro in my mind. Like that's why we would do it. Sure, we would have one less buzzy, itchy insect flying around, but that's sort of neither here nor there.
Another pro to throw out there that we haven't quite like really nailed down on is that as much as we always kind of con it with should we put our fingers on the scale like that,
Mm.
we already have because we introduced these
True.
animals to areas that they should not be in, and they are threatening species in their ranges. Again, we'll talk about that a little later in the episode, but like this is an argument that's been made of not just have we facilitated them moving from one area to another, climate change is changing the ranges
Yeah.
of where different mosquito species are active. So wiping them out, at least in certain areas, it is actually returning certain things to the natural order. It's not actually like messing with nature in the way that we
Right.
have done many, many, many times.
Right. That just brings me back to, I mean, I know we've talked about invasive species in general, but this is for some reason harkening back to our feral cat
Yeah.
conversation because we're the ones that brought cats around and let them run around outside. And I'm not in favor of eradicating feral cats. So then I feel like I wouldn't want to put this argument in that same way. But that is a very good point. Yeah, that we are dealing with mosquitoes as an invasive species in some ways. So yeah, for sure. But then I mean the cons are kind of not to discount what you just said, but just because we were the cause, I don't know if that necessarily gives us the right to then make another huge environmental shift
Yeah.
to try to wipe out a species. I am also of the opinion that nature's nature, and in some ways, I guess all species deserve to live. So,
Theoretically, I can feel how painful it is for you to try and make that argument
but
in this
I
basis.
but I do think that that's true. Like mosquitoes are a species that exists on this earth, so who are we to just say wipe them all out? And what would actually be the big ramifications of that, which maybe you have more on, but that is sort of my thinking is we don't know really what would happen if we did that.
I agree. I do want to kind of posit this maybe just as a rhetorical question. Do we then consider the bacteria that causes malaria to have inherent value? Because it's a species. It's a species of animal. It's bacteria.
Oh,
Like it is a species of living thing, at least. So just throwing it out there that I think like as someone who has made that argument many, many times, I do think the argument has a certain limitation that we don't always think about because we don't think about diseases as being their own like things that evolve to have a like purpose, which is to live.
that's
There you go,
what I
thinker.
will ponder this evening. But I look at that on a different scale, I would say, as
And I think
I
that's like both
do.
fair and
I,
maybe not. I think it's always worth kind of taking that to the logical extreme and seeing where maybe our arguments of like inherent value in nature maybe reach a limit at some point. So yeah, the pros, obviously reducing diseases, controlling what we've kind of made worse by our travels and by our changing of the climate, counterbalanced with these are animals that have a purpose on the planet. I think really what the most convincing argument in a lot of these scientific papers are for this is that it just has never worked.
yeah.
So one example is the yellow fever mosquito is a species. I never think about mosquitoes really having different species names, but they have common species names. The yellow fever mosquito in the 1930s and 40s was spreading a huge epidemic of yellow fever in South America. And there was a scientist, Dr. Soder, and he was bent on eliminating this mosquito, which was newly introduced to these areas, and spreading this disease to the local population. And so they were going to get rid of it. And so he was able to target them in Brazil and in the upper parts of Egypt to stop the spread of yellow fever. And he was actually pretty successful in the short term. In the late 30s and early 40s, they were basically able to almost entirely eliminate the species from the area and the disease, which is pretty incredible. Some of the caveats in there is that they were not established populations within the range. So they weren't species that were native to the area. And similar efforts that have been put in to eradicate native mosquito species from their area have been way less successful in the short and long term. The other thing is that they used a lot of DDT to do
Hmm.
that. So thinking about broad scale pesticide use, especially DDT, which we know now is something that causes cancer in humans and has disastrous ecological effects. He was able to successfully manage their population for a little bit there. There are some caveats as they started seeing yellow fever start to pop up more in rural areas. And that was because there were still some of those mosquitoes there, but also the disease had then been also transferred to animal reservoirs. So just like we've got COVID in white-tailed deer and we've got birds with different viruses that carry it around, monkeys had yellow fever, and if they bit somebody, that person could get yellow fever. So it's happening more in these rural areas versus the urban areas. This scientist really pushed for global efforts to continue fighting these diseases. But once the diseases left an area, there was a lot less political will to continue these really expensive and intensive population control for mosquitoes. Because there was less diseases in these areas, there were more successful urban areas. So they were able to, have a society that was able to better develop economically because there wasn't as much disease around. However, by wiping them out of that area for a short period of time, and by the time the mosquitoes returned, the population had less of a resistance to the disease and the epidemics returned. So this is just one example, and there's lots and lots of different examples of trying to control mosquito populations. This seemed like one of the biggest examples of something that could be considered successful for even a short period of time of eliminating, not just like reducing the population, but basically wiping it out, and without continuing to sue it. And also having to consider what was used to accomplish that in
Right.
the first place, it has never worked. Like, it has never worked to kill an entire species of mosquitoes. And it seems like the general consensus right now is that it won't.
Yeah. I we haven't even fully answered the question of whether or not we should. It doesn't seem like
Right.
we need to necessarily devote a lot of time and energy into figuring out the could we do it. Do you know what I mean? But that's not, again, we still have the whole disease aspect, which we absolutely need to work on
Right.
figuring out how to control. And I understand that that is why we're discussing the eradicating mosquitoes in the first place. But I don't know, it just, given the fact that it has never been successful, it maybe feels like that's not what we're supposed to do.
Um, yeah, I guess I slightly disagree because we're talking about all of this human suffering, which is like
Mhm.
from a distance because we're not personally
Right.
impacted. So for people around the world, this is urgent, but also what if it became more urgent? Like when Zika happened,
Right.
that all of a sudden became our problem in the US because it was possible, and that's not the worst of all the diseases, even though it causes issues for pregnant women. It's been associated with Guillain-Barré disease, which can cause paralysis and death. Like it's got its own things, but like the next pandemic could be mosquito borne,
Yeah.
and having options for at least in the short term, and not to say that people aren't looking at controlling
Yes, I
populations.
think that that is where my brain goes,
Okay.
is I'm not saying we don't do anything, but I'm saying that control rather than eradication for me feels like a more logical way to
Yeah.
go. But as you say, I'm speaking from a very sheltered place in this discussion. So,
I also maybe I'm just like completely convinced that eradication's not really possible, and so I'm
mhm.
totally like comfortable with as aggressive a form of control as makes sense. So historical efforts to mitigate the harm caused by diseases were really successful in for a while with the deployment of types of vaccines to treat things like yellow fever and dengue fever. That actually has been more difficult recently because at the time that those vaccines were introduced, there were a lot more authoritarian governments in the area. And so they were kind of like, everybody takes this. And it's been more difficult to have a wide scale implementation of these. They've looked at community-based mosquito control, and they found that, first of all, people were more convinced of its importance based on how annoying mosquitoes are versus how dangerous they are.
Which brings me back to the beginning of our discussion,
Yeah.
describing mosquitoes as the most annoying insect.
That feels like a very human response to be like, yeah, it's possible that we're gonna die, but like I know I'm gonna get bit anyway. It's gonna be annoying. But they also found that like people weren't super convinced, like they didn't think that their individual efforts made a difference, and they didn't believe that their neighbors were going to do enough, at least in the one study that I was seeing cited. They weren't believing that their whole community was participating enough for it to be effective. And so it sort of failed with like kind of a crisis of faith in each other of doing things like making sure you don't have standing water around, for example. That being said, there's lots of like there's mosquito nets, there's lots of mosquito control things happening around the world. What seems to be sort of the consensus is we're not trying, because they've done it in Madagascar, they've done it in a lot of places. We're not trying to fully wipe out this mosquito, but we are trying to control its population in emergency times to reduce outbreaks, and
Yeah.
then try and use different methods outside of like we're more comfortable doing things like widespread spraying when there's a really bad
Yeah.
outbreak versus using that as a preventative. Because the other thing we learned is that they develop resistance to our pesticides when we do that.
Sure.
So it's complicated, as many, many things are. But let's talk about mosquito control for conservation, which is very relevant this year. On Hawaii, there are currently 17 species of honey creeper, which are endemic endangered pollinator birds that live there. There used to be 50 different species of honey creepers on Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, but they have been largely lost to invasive species and habitat destruction. However, currently one of their main threats is avian malaria. And that's from one particular species, which is the southern house mosquito. avian pox, which is carried by the Asian tiger mosquito, which actually just within our lifetime has displaced other species of mosquito in like my neck of the woods. So we see them much more
Interesting.
often, and they bite during the day and the night. So they're
Lovely.
jerks.
I just have to make a completely irrelevant observation on the names of those two mosquitoes.
Yeah.
Just the strikingly different. You got your southern house mosquito here, which just feels very like common and
Yeah.
not fun either. And then your Asian tiger mosquito, which just feels more
They're big
like
and
pretty.
stripy.
Like they should be.
Yeah.
Are they pretty? Like
No, they're not pretty because
oh,
they're mosquitoes, but they are stripy and they're
okay.
big. But these two mosquitoes were both introduced to the Hawaiian Islands. Neither one of them are native. And they carry these diseases, but at least for the southern house mosquito, they are one of the species that requires compatible bacteria to reproduce. So this
Okay.
bacteria is called Wolbachia, and it is actually like Wolbachia bacteria is found in half of insects worldwide. And the bacteria strains highly specialized to their hosts. So they can do things like influence their diet, reduce their ability or increase their ability to reproduce, or make them just reproduce with other mosquitoes that have their same type of Wolbachia. And not even just like just reproduce. This is the only way that these mosquitoes can have viable eggs. So they'll reproduce and they'll lay eggs, but their eggs won't hatch unless they've got a compatible guy. So an organization called Birds Not Mosquitoes have come up with a plan. I like how direct that is. Okay, so here's the plan. First, they capture a bunch of mosquitoes and they took them to the mainland US because that's the only place that had a
Great.
facility to be able to do this. That's mostly where they seem to come from anyway. Like the Asian tiger mosquito is definitely from here, or not from here, but here.
Yeah.
Um, so they took the Wolbachia bacteria from the Asian tiger mosquito that is currently in Hawaii, and they put it in the gut of the southern house mosquitoes that are from Hawaii. So it is just switching species. And then they bred them a whole bunch so that they had a bajillion of them. And then they just took the males, because the males won't bite anybody. They took the males with now an incompatible version of the bacteria back to Hawaii, and they released them. And they feel like they have pretty good results to now move forward with a much bigger population control plan. Now, what they learned is that when they introduced the first batch of mosquitoes, is that those mosquitoes don't travel super far from their initial release area. And so they need to make sure that they get them up into the mountains where the populations of mosquitoes are and the impacted bird species live. But they got approval, and this is from a Scientific American article talking about this. The article is called Millions of Mosquitoes Will Rain Down on Hawaii to Save an Iconic Bird.
That is drama.
It is drama. So for the next phase beginning in November, which was 2023, the consortium will drop 250,000 treated mosquitoes twice a week over about 3,000 acres in East Maui for a year. They will be contained in mango-sized biodegradable capsules that can each hold about 1,000 mosquitoes.
So the idea here is just that these now incompatible males will outcompete any compatible. Like we're trying to outnumber the males with the compatible
Yeah.
bacteria. Is
And
that correct? And then that way they would just the females would just be laying all these non-viable eggs and would
yeah,
cause the population to die out.
I don't even know if it's like so much outcompete so much as like if you can just start with a couple, that's just gonna start like that female lays its eggs not knowing that those eggs aren't viable. And so she's not trying to like be like, I mated with that guy. Now I gotta go meet with somebody who actually has the right bacteria. Like she's done. And
Right.
you already now she dies within 2 to 4 weeks, so you
Yeah.
already have like a lesser population. Yeah. So yeah, basically it's a numbers game. I don't know if
Yeah.
outcompete is the word I would use, but yes, you're right on the basics of it is that, yeah, they're by not reproducing, the population over time will reduce. Now, they did say basically that if they start finding viable eggs with the new gut bacteria, like if something happens where they do find mates and they'll stop the experiment until they stop finding that again. So, there are some control mechanisms. The things I like about it is that they're not introducing any species, including the bacteria, that isn't already on Hawaii. Like the new bacteria is just in the gut of a different species.
Right.
So I thought that was really
Clever.
cool,
It's a
clever,
it's a good
tight.
workaround.
Yeah.
Because it is almost like introducing another species, but
Yeah.
it's not. It's just
It's
a
not.
different combination of two already existing species. So that's pretty smart. Pretty
That's
smart.
so smart. Yeah. So and what Birds Not Mosquitoes says is this: we are not thinking that we are going to eliminate these species of mosquitoes off of the island of Hawaii, and this is not alone going to save the honey creepers. This is a band-aid to buy us time. And the less mosquitoes there are, the less transfer of disease there is in the meantime. So that's going to give us time. Um, they like said basically that some of these species could be extinct within a year if we don't do something. So this is like a very smart, very coordinated, very intensive Hail Mary to save some of these species. But I think it's kind of also worth pointing out that like the mosquitoes are not the only problem.
Right.
And the mosquitoes wouldn't be there without us. So
Right.
there's some integration that needs to happen
Yeah.
between some of these different plans. Yeah.
But I will, yeah, I think that as a control measure with mosquitoes as our subject today, like that's a really cool
Super cool, right?
project. I like that.
I loved that it's like actually happening, so it's something we can follow up on. It's not just sort of theoretical. Um, GMO mosquitoes are actually also being deployed in other areas to help control populations. I was like, the other one I feel like everybody's going to be pretty on board with. I'm fine with the GMO mosquitoes, but I'll explain
Yep.
kind of what that is they've edited a gene so that when the eggs are laid, there's a self-limiting gene within them. So it's engineering the genes so that there is some sort of birth defect that would prevent the larva from being able to eventually become adults. Like it makes it so that they can't feed or they, have a short lifespan, whatever it is, it stops them from being able to get into biting form. So it's a very similar concept of like introducing non-compatible mates into the situation to help reduce them. Also, the Wolbachia mosquitoes have also been used in other contexts as well, and apparently homeowners in Kentucky can buy them for their own yard.
Interesting. I really feel like Wolbachia, that sounds so familiar to me, and I'm not familiar with this project, so, and I was not at all familiar with the idea of this relationship between mosquitoes and bacteria, but I wonder if I have come across something of this before because it is ringing serious
Feels
bells
right.
with me. I
We'll have to
will
see next
say,
episode.
yeah, I will say that for reasons that I can't put my finger on right now, the GMO mosquito bothers me a little bit more, not because of the GMO piece. So I don't know. I don't know why. I'll have to think about that one a little more, but it's interesting.
I think that like for me, the little like thing going on in my brain that's like, yeah, I don't know about that. It has to do with a little bit with like anytime we edit genes, do we know all of the consequences
Hmm.
of our decisions sort of situation? Whereas like the bacteria seems like we know what all the possible outcomes are going to be. It's either it's going to work or the mosquitoes will develop a compatible strain and then we got to stop. But we're basically back to baseline. Whereas the GMOs, like it feels like, but is there something we're missing? But I mean, I'm still for it. Other things that they've talked about is breeding the largest genus of mosquitoes. No, the genus of the largest mosquitoes. Um, that includes 90 species that do not feed on blood at all and are actually predators of other species at the larval stage. So being able
Ah,
to introduce that larva into the same pools as the other ones would be more of a biological Control, obviously, like there are other, when we introduce species, different areas, what are we doing? But that also seems like a cool, interesting idea. I'll quickly go through a little bit of what I thought was interesting about what influences mosquitoes to be able to bite you. So there was a study that came out that suggested that mosquitoes prefer people with type O blood. Sarah, what blood type do
I
you
have
have?
no
No
idea.
idea. Mine's B positive or something. That paper was later retracted.
Oh,
They're not, so it doesn't seem to hold merit. There's no conclusive evidence on that one. They think it's actually much more influenced by the smell of you. Um,
yeah.
so for
I
example,
read something somewhere. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I read
no,
something
go for it.
somewhere about like that your metabolism might have something to do with it. Is that true?
Yeah, we'll get into it in a moment. So
Okay.
basically how they're able to detect any of this is according to the National Institute of Health, female mosquitoes have nerve cells called CPA neurons that have a receptor that detect carbon dioxide, and this enables them to sense the plumes of air we exhale. But mosquitoes are still attracted to human skin even in the absence of carbon dioxide, which they are attributing to the bacteria that colonizes our skin. Because apparently when you sweat doesn't have an odor. It's when the sweat hits the bacteria and the
Hmm.
bacteria start to interact with it. The bacteria are also the ones who are putting out VOCs. We talked about VOCs, volatile organic compounds, as air pollution. Your skin gives off VOCs and carbon dioxide because of this bacteria. But your diet might influence your bacteria makeup. And so your diet could influence how you smell, which then influences the mosquitoes to whether or not they want to bite you. They've done studies with twins. They've figured out something in your DNA might have to do with it as well. There's also been studies that have looked at if a mosquito is infected with a malaria disease and the malaria is at its life cycle where it is then infectious, does that impact the female's behavior to then go bite people more? Also, in that is if you are infected with malaria, you smell like malaria to the mosquitoes. Does that impact whether or not they bite you more? Because they think that maybe it does, but there's so much conflicting information out there. There hasn't been enough like repeated studies to be able to support the idea that the bacteria definitely impacts the behavior of the mosquito. But the idea that that's out there is just like fascinating to me.
It is just a whole nother world. And again, just trying to imagine things from the mosquito perspective a little bit, just to be able to sense all of those things. This is once again a total
Yeah.
tangent, but I was reading not too long ago a book by Michael Crichton that I cannot for the life of me think of the name right now, but it was basically had to do with people being shrunk down to the size of insects and this journey that they took, like living in the insect world. And I keep coming back to that as we're talking about things because he would write obviously made up stuff, but with the semi-scientific basis just about the senses and the abilities and all of these things that these tiny animals are able to do. So it really is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the mosquitoes are insects, so they have compound eyes. We're not 100% sure how their vision is. There are so many factors into how we think that they're able to detect us as prey. Doesn't seem right. I don't know if we're prey. Parasitic, like hosts maybe, that we're still like just figuring it out species by species. And like that makes all of this so challenging because so many experiments have not been replicated,
Mhm.
partially because of all of these different factors going on, but partially because you also can't responsibly have a control group if there's an outbreak. Like you can't say, we'll let all the mosquitoes go do their thing in this one population of humans, and the
Right.
other one we will control one particular factor to see if that makes a difference. In all cases, you're always going to be trying to employ as many factors as possible. So trying to isolate the one thing that was most effective in that scenario is always hard because you can't really control for any of it. And that kind of brings us to small scale control. probably our listeners aren't in charge of any government organizations who are going to be deciding mosquito policy. Although all of your states, I promise, have a like mosquito page on their departments because I read the Florida's little resources and all of them because it is a public health sort of thing.
Hmm.
Will have information about the mosquitoes that live in your area and different things that you can do for it. One of the reasons I got really interested in this is because at work, a lot of people were coming in asking for mosquito repellent plants, which I went on. I don't love anecdotal evidence. I'm also not someone to yuck someone's yum. If I'm not going to be like, it doesn't matter because that's not what they want to hear so much as there are other things that you should be employing. Like
Right.
if you want a citronella hanging basket, more power to you. But there are other things that you can do that are more effective. I tried to find any data that had like actually tested any of this, and I did not really find any papers that looked at the effectiveness of different species. So the best answer I could really come up with is there is no data that supports plants as a deterrent,
Yeah.
but there isn't necessarily a paper that's like, we
It
proved
definitively
plants don't
doesn't
work.
work. Yeah.
Right. Now, a scientist that James Dill, he's an entomologist, said basically that there isn't any evidence that mosquito repellent plants actually repel mosquitoes. Some of those plants contain compounds that protect the plants themselves from insects. However, they don't exude those into the air. And even if you were to like rub them on your skin, they would evaporate so fast that they would not do the job. When we use those compounds in effective mosquito repellents, they're typically concentrated down and part of a solution that is meant to last for a longer period of time. So the best I can give you is there is no evidence that supports that mosquito repelling plants work, and that entomologists have arguments about why logically it doesn't make sense that they would work. That being said, if they seem to work for you, go
More
do
power to
what you
you.
want. Yeah,
Give it a shot.
do it. Plant your eucalyptus and lavender and things like that. But there are things that have been proven to help reduce mosquitoes. The first is, of course, getting rid of standing water. That's where they're going to reproduce. And so if you have a bunch of standing water around, you're going to have prime habitat for female mosquitoes to be able to find a place to lay her eggs. Um, the number one thing that all of these places recommend is applying personal protection spray. DEET is the gold standard for personal applicated sprays. Formulas of up to 30% concentration can be applied to kids over the age of 2 months. So it's considered very, very safe when it comes to bug repellents. There are different formulas, so different concentrations of it that last for different lengths of effectiveness. So you want to read the bottle and pick the one that makes sense for you. You're only applying it to exposed skin. You're not going to apply it under your clothes. And you just want to be careful. Don't put it on a wound. Don't put it in your eyes or your mouth. Don't inhale it, that sort of stuff. Read the bottle. But it is generally considered very, very effective. There is a lemon eucalyptus essential oil, basically, that is also considered very effective, but you're not supposed to apply that to children under the age of 3. That can have more allergic reaction sort of stuff to it. But I've used that spray before and it smells delightful compared to DEET. So it just depends on what you like. The thing that we are doing in our yard right now, we have one of those mosquito repelly kind of guys, the like little machines, the thermocells. There are claims that they can deter mosquitoes within like an acre. That's probably an over exaggeration. They're probably a more like close scale. They work often by like attracting them via a scent and then sucking them down onto a sticky pad. Mosquitoes are extremely weak flyers, so they shouldn't be bothering you on a windy day. And if you have a fan blowing outside, that will also help them not be able to get to you. So that's an easy, like non-toxic way. What we're doing in our backyard right now is using a mosquito trap, basically with BTI. Sarah, are you familiar with mosquito dunks?
No.
Okay. So mosquito dunks, back when we worked together, do you remember our little alligator pond?
Yeah.
They put the mosquito dunks in there because that was standing
That's
water.
right.
Yeah. So mosquito dunks, they come in either granulars or in these like little round like O shapes.
Hmm.
And they contain a bacteria. Everything comes back to bacteria, called Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis. Um, and it's a bacteria that basically prevents it kills the larva of mosquitoes, black flies, and some other small organisms that reproduce in water. It is one of those organic, not gonna hurt pollinators sort of thing. It doesn't impact fish or frogs or other non-target species. It's all about mosquitoes, midges, and black flies. And you can apply it to standing water. So if you've got a pond, like one of those little garden ponds, if you've got something that's a standing water element around there, you can toss one of these things in, and that should help reduce your mosquitoes. We are doing something that scientist Doug Tallamy recommends and the Audubon Society recommends, but I haven't found any science to back it up. So right now, this is all anecdotal. We have a 5-gallon bucket in the back of our yard, and there's water in it, and there's like grass clippings in it. Doug Tallamy recommends hay. I don't have hay, so I'm going to put grass in it. And you let it break down for a couple days so that it's emitting some of those decomposing smells that attract female mosquitoes to standing water. It's got chicken wire over the top so nothing falls in. And then you put the mosquito dunk in there, and you only have to put a little piece. And like these mosquito dunks are very, very inexpensive, so you don't feel bad about using them. And the idea is that you're creating the perfect habitat for the females to lay their eggs in, and then you kill the larva. And we had my sister's graduation party outside, and we did not get bit by mosquitoes. So far, anecdotally, we're having a good time. A lot of places, like even when I took my daughter to the doctor because she was sick, they recommended getting our yard sprayed for mosquitoes because she's little and, that can be really uncomfortable for them, especially when, you're 1 year old and you're scratching with your little nails because you're itchy and uncomfortable. That's not something we're interested in because when you broadcast spray, you can't target mosquitoes. You
Yeah.
end up killing fireflies and all sorts of other pollinators. So this is going to be our attempt at controlling our mosquito population because we live in a very wet area.
I like it. We'll have to get updates as the summer
Yes.
goes on.
Is there anything that you do living in Florida to protect yourself from mosquitoes?
I've got bug spray in my car.
I mean, it is the gold standard.
That's about all I've got. I have not, knock on wood, fingers crossed, had a huge problem around my house at this point. I do look for things like standing water, but I sat outside the other evening for a little bit and I ended up with one bite at the end of that, but it was not bad. So around my house it's not been bad, but I have been getting bit just on my runs even during the day a little bit here. So now I do carry spray in my car now.
Way to go. Sarah, that's mostly what I've got about mosquitoes. Again, this is like a very shallow look
Nope.
into
It was great.
mosquitoes.
Learned
So
lots, new perspectives.
good.
It
I'm
was great.
glad. Awesome. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you wanna hang out here for a second, we're gonna give you a challenge of the week. All right, guys, we're back with our challenge. If you have never listened to an episode of A Little Greener before, each week we give you a challenge that corresponds with the topic of the episode. You don't have to do it this week if it's not relevant to you. But anytime you listen to an episode, if you decide to do a challenge, you should let us know. You should tag us, so we can see what everybody's doing. And this is one of our ways of making an impact. It's not just about education, it's about some action as well. As for mosquitoes, I think that a good challenge is to first look up what kind of mosquitoes live in your particular area. Because you'll start to, anytime I learn a little bit more about something, you start to see it everywhere. So I think it's a good way to inform yourself of what you're looking at, especially because most of us aren't familiar with bugs. And then my other part of the challenge is to go outside and spend some time, your nature time outside, and just take a look at what the insects are around you. Because if you do live in an area where they're broadcast spraying for mosquitoes, like you might want to know what other insects might be impacted if that's a practice that's implemented. Things like fireflies should be active pretty soon, but other nighttime beetles and different types of worms and pollinators and flies and all sorts of things should be around you. So take some time to observe the bug life in your nature time.
We picked a tough insect, but insects on the whole, I mean, and mosquitoes included, truly are just incredibly fascinating and often underappreciated. So yeah, it's nice to take some
I
time
don't
to recognize them.
appreciate mosquitoes anymore. I appreciate how complex they are
Yeah,
compared to what I thought. But I still don't want them anywhere near me. So when I be looking out for them, I'll be squishing them.
I think that that is fair. But I honestly do think that it is cool to be able to appreciate their complexity in that way. That does not mean that you have to like the bug or want them around, but I think just gaining a better understanding of them is actually a worthy thing to do. Thanks for all of that info. It was really interesting.
Thanks for listening for this long. If the folks want to contact us about their mosquito stories, how can they do that?
You can find us right now on Facebook, A Little Greener Podcast, or you can send us an email at alittlegreenerpodcast@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.